Welcome back to our Ubuntu server series here at CBT Nuggets. Today we're going to talk about mail, specifically email, and POP3 and IMAP. So sending mail, getting mail, retrieving mail remotely, all those maily sort of things. So the first thing I want to cover is just pointing out that we're talking about two different processes. We're talking about sending and receiving the email. So this is actually the server that handles the transfer of the email, and often this is the SMTP, referred to as SMTP, or Simple Mail Transfer Protocol. This is the protocol that we use to send and receive email, and there are a plethora of server daemons that will handle this process. Now, SendMail has been around forever. SendMail is kind of like the official oldest, I think it's the oldest, email sending and receiving program out there. There are a ton of programs that handle email now. Every distribution tends to have its default. Most people use Postfix in Ubuntu. In fact, Postfix is just a wonderful program, mainly because the configuration files are fairly simple to understand and use. It installs easily. It works well out of the box. Most people using Ubuntu would recommend Postfix as the email system. All of these will work. Some people are really fond of this simple SMTP, a little redundant there, but we're going to talk about Postfix in this nugget because this is one that is most commonly used. And then accessing email. Now, accessing means, so we're not talking about sending and receiving email from server to server, but with your client. So like with Thunderbird or with Exchange or whatever it is that you're using as your email client, this is how you access your mail stored on your server, whether it's your ISP's server or your server. And generally that's done with either IMAP or POP3 or the secure versions of those. Now there's probably more than these three. These are just three that I thought of off the top of my head. Daemons that will allow you to access and retrieve the email off of the server. Right now, this is pretty much the de facto standard. Everybody uses Dovecot. It's very secure, it's very simple, it's easy to set up. It supports IMAP and POP3, also IMAP Secure and POP3 Secure. So really, Dovecot is the go-to daemon for handling the retrieval of email remotely. These other two, and some of these servers over here are like a complete package deal, and they'll do both the SMTP and the IMAP and POP3 stuff. But the two that we're going to focus on in this nugget are Dovecot and Postfix, and that's kind of like the Ubuntu way of doing email. Generally, when people talk about serving and hosting email on Ubuntu, these are the two packages that they use. So that's what we're going to use. They're fairly easy to set up, but let's go to the computer and see what to do. By now, this is a fairly familiar setup here. We're going to open up a terminal window and log into our Ubuntu server. I haven't mentioned in a few nuggets. Again, the server that we're connected to is not this actual workstation with the blue background that we see, but we are SSH'd in with a remote connection to our CBT server, which is running Ubuntu 12.04. What we're going to do is install Postfix. So right now, we don't have any email server installed at all. So when we install Postfix, it'll go through the installation process like any other program, and immediately it asks us what kind of Postfix configuration we want to do. Now, I really like using apt-get or Debian or Ubuntu because a lot of these configuration files just, a lot of these configuration wizards, if you will, start up right during the installation, and Postfix is no different. We have several different options with explanations here. I'll explain a little bit more of these in just a second on the whiteboard, but basically we have to choose which type of installation we want. Now, no configuration, basically you get a broken system, so we don't want that. Internet site, if you're setting up a traditional email system that's going to directly interact with the internet site is the way to go. Internet with SmartHost means you can receive email. However, you're going to use like your ISP's SMTP server in order to send email out to the internet. Satellite system means that all mail coming and going is going to go through a separate system. And local only means that you're only going to be able to send mail locally, just like it says. So this is only, that way only people on the local server can email each other. Generally, you're going to want one of two, either internet with smart host if you want to actually receive email, or satellite system. And we're going to do internet with smart host, and then as this is installing, I'm actually going to go and explain a few of these more in detail. It asks us the name of our server, and since we're going to be just on my local network, I can leave it like this, but this is where you would do something like cbtserver.nuggetlab.com. Okay, so this is, and again, the directions tell you this is going to be a fully qualified domain name. So where are you going to get your email? Now, if this was the email server for nuggetlab.com, it could just be nuggetlab.com. It's talking about what is the email domain. Where are you going to be receiving? If this is your email server for the entire domain, then this is where you would just put nuggetlab.com. SMTP relay host. Now remember, I said that I set this up as an internet host with smart relay, or internet with smart host. What this means is it's going to receive email, but it's not going to try to send it out on the internet. So we would put something like, for me, I would put smtp.charter.net. That's my ISP's SMTP server that I'm allowed to use. It's going to do this. Now let's go to the slide really quick. And I just want to further talk about these ideas, because this is going to be crucial when you're installing your email server, what exactly is going on. So the first option, no configuration, basically you end up with a box of rocks. It's useless, right? There's no configuration done. If you want to do everything by hand, by all means go ahead, but I think that's a silly thing to do. Now, internet, at first glance, this seems like it might be a good idea. Set up an internet host that's going to send and receive email directly. The problem is spam, right? Now, if this was 10, 15 years ago, it wouldn't be a problem to set up an internet host to send and receive email. But now, hardly any ISPs or anybody getting email is going to trust email coming from some random person on a dynamic DNS or on a dynamic IP in their home computer, because that's how spammers try to do things. So if you try to set your computer up as an internet host and you haven't gone through all the prerequisites of setting up an SPF record and doing things outside of the scope of this nugget, most of your email will never arrive. So I don't recommend setting up a straight up internet host. So you're going to want to do one of these bottom two, either internet with smart host. Now this means that you can send or you can receive email directly and send email out to others via your ISP, which is what we just set up in the walkthrough process. This is useful if you want to be able to receive email, you want people to send it to you, and you also want people to get it, right? The problem with this is that you'll probably receive a lot of spam as well. It's getting to the point now where it's more and more difficult for a small single server environment to handle internet email. Spam is just so prevalent. And so maybe you want to do a satellite system. What this means is that all of your mail traffic, I guess I should specify, mail traffic goes to another machine. This is good for a number of reasons. One, it means that you're not really handling the email on your local machine, so that can be a good thing, especially when we talk about big bad spam. But this is also good on your local network if you have a bunch of servers and you have one central internal mail server. Well, all of your other servers can be satellite systems. And then if like a local daemon like the Apache daemon says, hey, I ran out of disk space, and it tries to send an email to warn you, it's going to route to this central internal mail server, and then you can get all of your mail from that one central place. So satellite system is a good idea if you have multiple servers in your network, even if you are hosting an actual internet live mail server. Your secondary servers can be satellite systems, so that you just use that central internal mail server. So that's what these mean. And again, you're probably going to use one of these two, either this one or this one, depending on your needs. Okay, and like I mentioned down here, if you want to use mail locally but actually want outgoing mail to work, yeah, you want to use a smart host or a satellite system. All right, so let's go back to the command line, and the setup is just about done, but let's check it out and see how it's working. So here we are back on the command line, and the system is installed, and it gave us a bunch of great information to look at after the install was complete. So it told us, a lot of these things we entered, destinations, the host name that we talked about. It says that the aliases file exists but doesn't have a root alias. Now, setting up aliases is a little outside of the scope of this network, or of this nugget, but basically this file contains we'll look at it real quick. What the heck? So this file contains aliases for who gets what sort of email. So if email is sent to Postmaster, it gets forwarded to root. Now we could add one. Any email going to root goes to Sean Powers at cbtnuggets.com. We'll save this file, and then we have to run new aliases, and that updates the aliases database so that if email is sent to root, it will now get rerouted to my CBT Nuggets account, which is kind of cool. So let's actually test this. Let's see if our email server in smart host mode is working. Now, in order to send an email, I could configure something like Thunderbird to use this as outgoing email, but we're going to install MailUtils, and what this is a command line email program. So we're going to install this. It's going to install some seriously old school email program, right? And that will give us the ability to say mail root. CC nobody, subject, this went to root. And then we can type our message. This is the message. And then on a blank line, Control D. Told you it was old school. And so now the email has been sent. So let's see if the email actually went out. Here's my CBT Nuggets email account. And it appears that the email has not arrived. So let's go back and see if we got some errors on our server, and let's try to fix those errors. So, okay, we sent the email, and unfortunately, it didn't arrive. So let's see if we got any bounces. Okay, so let's check our local mail here. Well, okay, truth be told, I already looked at my email. So let's actually just look at the red email already, which is stored in the inbox folder, and see what it said. So this is the bounce message that I got from our server. And if we read through it, it tells us why it bounced and never made it. It's because cbtserver.nuggetlab.com does not exist. This is, even our Charter Smart Host, while it can send mail, it's not going to send it from a bogus server that doesn't have a real DNS server. So that was my fault for making something up. Again, the world of email is pretty serious, and they don't want fakery afoot. So let's do a dpackage reconfigure postfix. And what this does is it'll start that wizard again, and let's make some changes to make it actually work from our setting where we are right now. So we still want an internet with smart host. But instead of the system mail name being that, actually let's make it home.brainofsean.com. This is just my home DNS address. I know that this is a valid address. We're going to use the same SMTP relay. Default. It's going to go through and set stuff up. Now let's make sure that our alias that we set up is still there. It is. So the alias for root is Sean Powers at cbtnuggets.com. So let's try another email. We're going to mail root, no CC. Test 2 is another test. And so now the email has been sent. So let's see if this time we were able to get email out on the internet. Bam, and now it made it to the greater internet. Here is our test from our home server, and since I used an actual DNS name, now we are able to send it out to the internet using our smart host. So it's important to test things. Obviously my fake DNS setting that I used just for our nugget, it didn't work, because when we tried to send it to the actual internet, our smart host said, dude, that's not even a real DNS name. You can't just send fake email. That's called spam, right? So we set it up with a real DNS name, and now we are able to send email. So we know that our system is working. We know that we can send mail and we should be able to receive mail, although that gets kind of funny too because this is not set up at, accepting on port 25 because I don't want to receive spam from all over the country. So we can send mail like this. We could say mail as Powers. And so we've mailed S Powers on the local machine. Let's test and see if we actually get it. Sure enough, we got the email. So we know that local email is working. And if it accepted something from the internet, including spam, we would probably get that as well. So that's basically how you go about setting up postfix. Again, I recommend either using a satellite system or internet with SmartHost, and then make sure that you're using actual DNS names, as we learned through the School of Hard Knocks. All right. So one more thing is, now we need to be able to retrieve our mail, because you probably are not a big fan of this command line mail interface. While it's really cool and great for testing, it's not exactly the way you wanna send and receive email on a daily basis. You want to use a client which will use IMAP or POP3. So that's the next step. Now the server daemon we're going to use is called Dovecot. We mentioned that earlier. And in order to get Dovecot to use IMAP and POP3, we actually need to install two packages. So these two packages will install Dovecot with the appropriate protocols installed to handle both IMAP and POP3. Now, if you're unfamiliar with IMAP and POP3, IMAP is generally used if you want to store your email on this server and just access the email remotely. So it'll actually stay on the server and have like a folder structure on the server that you can access remotely from your desktop or from your phone. And then POP3 is generally used if you only get your email in one spot. You want to actually remove the email from the server. It's stored on your local desktop computer. Or sometimes this is used if you want to import from one account to another, but they're fundamentally different in how they work. Okay, so IMAP stores it on the server, and POP3 retrieves it from the server. Now you can leave messages on the server with POP3, but in general, think of POP3 as removing them, popping them right off the server, and IMAP is mapping folders on the server and just reading the folders from the remote server. They don't actually remove any of the emails from the server. You just actually access it remotely. Okay, so the configuration files for Dovecot are stored in etc. Dovecot. Now, it's kind of a transitional phase or a duplicity that is a little bit annoying. It's not quite as elegant as Apache's configuration files, but it's kind of similar in how it's set up. I just don't know if it's quite as smooth or quite as well thought out. But dovecot.conf is the main configuration file, and that's stored there. We're actually gonna have to put some things in there. And then there's also this conf.d folder that has a whole bunch of other configuration files that are all parsed and all read in together to when the Dovecot daemon starts. It's important to note that we do have to do things because out of the box, it's broken out of the box. OOTB is out of the box there. So out of the box, Dovecot doesn't work well. So we have to actually do some configuration before it works. And it can be really annoying to troubleshoot, and I'll talk about that a little bit as well. One of the things we're going to have to configure is what sort of mailbox system we're using. If you're not familiar with mailboxes or you're not sure what your system is using, well, by default, Postfix uses Mbox. You may remember from a little bit ago that Mbox file that we looked at that stores email. Basically, email can be stored on a server in two different ways. The Mbox there's just one file that stores all of your emails. So all of the emails are just concatenated right together in one email file. The other method is called mail directory, or maildir is usually how you'll see this set up. So this is how Mbox works. Maildir works by every email is stored in its own file. Now there are advantages and disadvantages to both ways. Mbox is easier to get corrupt. Again, everything is in one file, so it's easier for things to get corrupt. Mail directory or maildir uses tons and tons of inodes on your server hard drive because every email is its own file. So you can get hundreds of thousands or millions, depending on how many users you have,
files on your server. So advantages and disadvantages of both. We're going to look at the default, which is Mbox. That's what Postfix uses by default, so that's what's on our system that we just installed. But it's important to know what you're using, and if you don't know, chances are you're using Mbox. Okay, so we need to go configure Dovecot, because when we install these two packages, like I said, out of the box, it's going to be broken. So let's install it, configure it, and then test it out. So we're back here on our server. We know that Postfix is running. We just tested that. We sent email and we can receive email. So we know that that is working. The next step is to install the two packages, Dovecot POP3D and Dovecot IMAP-D. Again, the D is for daemon. So these two packages will install those two protocols. So yes, we go ahead and install these. You'll see it's creating a bunch of those configuration files in the conf.d folder, and we're going to have to go and look at some of those anyway just to make it work. Remember, it's broken. We have a freshly installed, completely broken system. Another thing to note is that it's created a self-signed certificate for SSL authentication or for SSL encryption, so don't be surprised if later on we see, whoa, this is a self-signed certificate. This isn't one that we paid for. However, it does generate it, so we can still encrypt our traffic, which is an important thing. All right, so let's go into etc. Dovecot. Mentioned in that slide, this is where the configuration files are stored, and there's a few things we need to do. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is edit dovecot.conf, which is the main configuration file, but like I said, now things are getting split up into conf.d as well, so it's kind of a strange, where are things located? Well, we're going to start with dovecot.conf, and this is informative. There's not a whole lot in here. A lot of it is pointing to other files, but there's a few things in here that we need to change and then add. One of the first things I like to do is, even though by default this is set, I like to specify that I want it to listen on asterisk. Now what that means, I'm going to erase the IPv6 stuff because we're not running IPv6, but basically this means all the IP addresses that you want it to listen on, I want it to listen not just on 127.0.0.1, I want it to listen on all IP addresses. So I set this, I'm actually going to specifically enable this directive and make sure that that's there. By default, that's probably how it's going to be, but I like to specify it just to make sure it's listening on all IP addresses. The other things we need to do are add to the end of this file what protocols we want to use. Now we installed POP3 and IMAP, but that's actually 4 different protocols that we installed. We installed IMAP, IMAP-S, POP3, and POP3S. And we have to specify that we want all 4 of those. If we don't want all 4 of these, if you don't want POP3 stuff to work or POP3S, you don't have to, but I recommend, putting all these in here. And one nice thing that Dovecot does by default is it doesn't allow plain text authentication over non-encrypted protocols. Okay, so if we wanted to be able to connect to non-encrypted IMAP with a plain old password, we would have to add another line here, disable plain text auth equals no, because by default plain text authentication over an insecure protocol or unsecure protocol is disabled. So this will allow us to authenticate over IMAP using plain text. Okay, this is a security risk, but in your environment, this is how you would turn that on. It can be frustrating with Dovecot at times because without Googling this or taking this this nugget, you wouldn't know how to do that, and it looks like it should work because we've enabled IMAP, but all of a sudden just because the protocol is enabled we can't authenticate, and it can be very frustrating because it'll just say authentication error, and that you've used the correct login and password. It can be very, very frustrating. So those are the changes we need to make in here, and I'm going to take you now to something that we need to set because, boy, I'll tell you what, you want to talk about frustration. The first time I set up Dovecot, it took me a long time to figure out, and I was pulling my hair out trying to figure out why I got a crazy message in my log file that said unknown user. It is completely not indicative of what was actually wrong. Now in here, you may want to check out all of these files. These are all configuration files that are parsed and then added together with the dovecot.conf file to start the Dovecot daemon. But the one that we want to look at in order to configure it, again, this is out of the box broken. We have to, as root, edit the mail 10-mail.conf file. And what we have to do here is specify the type of mailboxes that we have. Remember I talked about mbox versus mail directory or maildir? Well, none are specified here. So we have to tell it what kind of system we have. For us, it's mbox. And by default, it's this middle one. Now, you wouldn't necessarily know that, so I'm just telling you that var mail and then user, this is a variable that substitutes the username. This is where mail is stored. And then it's saying that in the, and save it inside mail on the local user's home directory. That's where you want the stuff stored. So inbox is here, store the rest of the mail in a file called mail using the mbox format. So we actually need to uncomment this line to tell it that we want to use the mbox format. If we don't uncomment this line, it's going to give us, like I said in the log message, it'll say unknown user. It won't say anything about mbox or maildir. It'll say unknown user, which makes no sense, and it really annoys me if you can't tell. So those few changes we've made should allow us to connect to our server and get the mail that should be there waiting for us, because remember we just sent that mail to make sure that local mail was working. So we will need to restart Dovecot because we've made changes. So we'll restart the service. It should be running now. And now let's go and set up, by default here, we'll just start Thunderbird on our client machine. Say skip this, use my existing email. We're going to put in our information and see how it does it, just auto detecting stuff. I'm going to say spowers. I'm going to use the IP address just to make sure that it finds the server. Put in my password. Continue. So it's looking up to see if it can figure it out, and it did. It automatically figured out the information for my server. If we click on the manual config, you can see exactly what it did here. So IMAP is what we're using. We could use POP3, but I like IMAP, so we'll use IMAP. Let's see how it goes if we do just how it was automatically detected. So I haven't made any changes, and it's going to say, whoa, there's a certificate in place here. However, this certificate is not signed. Remember, it created its self-signed certificate, so this is normal. We expect this. There is an encryption certificate in place. However, this is not, a paid-for certificate, so this is fine. We expect this. We say confirm it. And no errors, so we click on the inbox, and look, there is the email that we sent earlier. How cool is that? So we know that it's working because we just retrieved via IMAP this email that we sent just a little bit ago from the command line. And this is from another computer. Remember, this is our workstation. Our server is on the remote computer at 192.168.1.80. So it's working. We've configured Dovecot. We used IMAP, but we could have used POP3. Everything that we expected to happen happened, and that's because we went through and changed a few of those configuration things inside the etc. Dovecot folder. The School of Hard Knocks is a really rough way to figure out Dovecot, so hopefully you paid attention to the few things that we do need to change in here to get a working system going. And we have now an encrypted system. We had to accept that self-signed certificate, but this is even secure now, right? We're using SSL to retrieve our email, so it's not like it's plain text going over the network. That should do our system. Let's make sure we have everything covered, and then we'll wrap this nugget up. Boy, I really tend to make a mess out of these slides, don't I? But what we've done here, we've installed Dovecot, we have it working, we even tested to make sure IMAP is working, POP3 is working. We didn't test it, but it's working. I mean, the protocols are just different protocols, but they're all installed. We learned about the configuration file. We learned that Dovecot is broken out of the box. You need to fix some things. We need to fix that, specifically 10-mail.conf. We need to set up what type of email box we have, and we need to add some things into the dovecot.conf file as well. Okay, so we learned about mbox and mail directory. We are using mbox by default in postfix, which takes us to the postfix slide. We learned about the different types of postfix installations. One of these two is what you want, and remember, it uses Mbox by default. You can configure it to use MailDir or Mail Directory if you want. That's an exercise that you can do on your own. It's not difficult to configure. It just stores, again, emails as individual files. And that finishes up our configuration of Postfix and Dovecot, which means that we can send and receive and check and retrieve and set up Thunderbird. We can do everything with email now. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.